All right, next up we are going to, we're going to go back into our SAS Studio session. Right, and remember last time we actually set up our environment. Now we're going to compile our SAS code while this is initializing. Right, so this is the SAS code from the adult, right, the SAS code for the lab and the youth data. And what we're going to do here is convert these DAT files to actual SAS files that we can use and dump them into this NHANES dataset folder. Right now, the NHANES dataset folder that I highlighted is empty, right? So first thing we're going to do is we are going to, let's start off with adult, right? And notice there's code that says file name, right? Where are we going to put this file? What are we going to call this file name? It's going to be called adult. And where's its location, right? So this location, D drive, does not exist. We actually have to go in, because it's sitting on the cloud, and right click right over here. Actually, better way is right click on adult.ddat, go to properties, highlight this, copy, and I'm just going to paste this right in. Right, I'm going to make sure I save my code. Your code is your bread and butter. You definitely want to save everything. And then I'm just going to hit the little running man, and it's going to run all this stuff. One other thing I want to do is, right, before I run this, right, so it's going to point and say, where am I going to look for this adult DAT? It's going to be an object called adult. And then this adult object that has this data set is going to run all this formatting, and it's going to save it in the new file called work, right? A quick thing about what we want to do is if I go to my SAS syntax file, notice there's nothing in here right now, right? So I'm just going to say right over here, I'm going to save this program here as this is going to be my main code that I use. We'll just call it main NHANES, right? And this is the main data set with all my analyses and all my data manipulation that we're going to be using long term, right? So I'm just going to save it in here. Oh, we're just going to save inside the SAS syntax folder. And notice it's going to be right over here, right? So before this file here, right? Remember, in the in file is where we're going to pull from, which is this file over here, right? And then the data is what is a new file we're going to make, right? The question is, how are we going to dump it in this folder here, right? Before we can do that, we need to learn about libname. Libname stands for library name. And remember I said before that any analysis that you have to do, right, it has to be in libraries before we can do any manipulation. When I say manipulation, I mean before any data sets are created or deleted, it has to be referenced to a library. Now the library, if it's a permanent library, it's got to be referenced to a location. In this case, we're going to reference that location to this location folder on a server. So I'm going to call this library NHANES, and then the location of this is actually right over here. So I'm just going to right click in, go to my properties, highlight this location, paste it in, and I'm just going to define my library, and it's going to be called NHANES. Notice, so if I go to my libraries, notice now we have a library called NHANES, right? So anything, if I want to create something inside the NHANES folder, like any type of file that shows up in the NHANES library, right? This is the library within SAS. But then remember, the library within SAS actually sits on its reference to a file on our server, a folder on our server called NHANES dataset. So anytime I want to save something like a data set to this folder, I'm going to have to define the library called nhaynes, and then I need to give it a file name. So if I want to save something in here, right, I'm going to call it nhaynes, which is the library, dot, I'm going to call it adult1. So I'm going to go over here, cut this, and replace that with work. Right, so right over here, when I run everything now, you're going to see that adult1 will actually have the SAS data set, and it'll show up in this library called nhaynes in a minute. And in reality, that permanent location is actually referenced to a folder called nhaynes dataset. Because remember, we made that reference to the library right over here. We said that nhaynes dataset, right, this is the location of our library. So anything that gets saved to our library, right, such as adult1, will show up in this library, right? And where's this library sitting? Well, it's sitting on a folder on the cloud called nhaynes dataset as defined up here, right? So now I'm going to run this entire code, and we should see our adult1 SAS dataset in adult1, and it should sit inside nhaynes dataset if all goes right. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to run it. And we have a nice little, let's see. Okay, so we have a little error right here, right? Statement is not valid or placed out of proper order, right? How are we going to do this? Let's actually go back to the code. Let's fix this. Let's kind of indent this just to make it cleaner. Because I don't like. Okay. And if I come all the way down here, scroll down a little. I'm just going to put a little run statement because it just tells SAS that the whole process is over. So SAS knows when to stop compiling this code in this program. So now I'm going to run that. Let's see if that works. And we are in luck. We have 20,000 rows, right? Notice we have a nice little blue screen right over here. Right, and let's check over here. And look at here. If we click over here, we have adult1.sas7b data, and we actually have raw data, which is good, right? And notice it is produced in this library called nhaynes, adult1. This is where we can do analysis on this file now because it's sitting in our library in SAS, right? Before we could not, now we can. And it's in the correct SAS format. So just for a little more practice, I'm going to save the adult file. Right. And I'm going to close out of this, and then I'm going to do the same thing with our lab data, right? Just so it's a little more practice. So file name, right? We're going to have a file name called lab, but where is this sitting, right? That lab DAT file is sitting right over here. So let's go to properties. I'm going to copy this. Right. I'm going to just shift this over. And notice I'm going to call this nhaynes lab 1. And you're probably saying, why is that? Because remember, we defined that right over here. We defined the lab name, or the library name was nhaynes as this location, right? We defined it already. And we're going to say when we compile this and we run all this stuff, right, the results called lab 1 is going to show up in our nhaynes library. And where, so it's in our library, our SAS library called NHANES, and where in reality is our NHANES library? Well, in reality, it's sitting on a folder right over here, right? Home RLE11 NHANES dataset, because we defined it earlier in this code over here. So if I come over here, I'm going to run this whole thing. Oh, I'm just going to put a little run statement because the run tells SAS to actually stop the process. Okay, here we go. I'm going to save it because I like to save my code, and then I'm just going to run everything here. Quick thing about SAS, if you want to just run one line, you can just highlight the one line and run it like this, right? And rule of thumb is always see if there's any errors or warnings, right? Right now there's 0, that's good, and there's really no warnings and nothing showed up, nothing red or says error actually showed up. So I'm going to go back over to my code, right? Again, if I want to highlight, if I want to run all this, I don't need to highlight all this because notice this is the only code that we're going to run, right? And what is this saying? It's saying take this lab, right? So if we go over here, it says this lab file location, right? There's actually a file called lab.dat. Now SAS can't see it, right? Because SAS uses 7bdat, right? And in this file, put all these formats in. Where's our new data set going to show up? Well, it's going to show up in the NHANES library. Where's the NHANES library? Well, we defined it back over here in the adult file, right? The NHANES library is really sitting right over here, right? And we're going to call it lab1. So theoretically, when we compile this, we should have lab1 show up here. And where is lab1 sitting? In reality, it's going to show up right over here. So the SAS environment is actually the libraries, and the actual reality environment, what's happening in real life, is actually going to sit over here. All right, so let me just run everything. And hopefully we get a lab file. And it looks like we are, what is going on? Okay, it looks like we have a SAS file. Okay, we do have a SAS, but why do we not have any rows? Right, this is not. Okay, maybe we shouldn't have this run statement. Okay, let's just save this. Let's just run everything again. Okay, here we go, 29,000 rows, right? And if we go in the library and we go to NHANES, there should be a lab1 right over here, and here it is, right? And again, this is the file over here.